Frank wiped the sweat from his brow as he shut the door behind him. The smell of dinner, herb chicken maybe, lingered in the air, but the house was silent. His heavy boots scuffed against the hardwood as he walked toward the kitchen, where Caitlin sat at the table. She was scrolling through her phone, her manicured nails clicking rhythmically against the screen. Her gaze didn't lift as he entered. "Hey," Frank said, his voice warm despite the exhaustion clinging to him like the grease stains on his work shirt. Caitlin muttered, barely looking up. Her perfectly arched brows furrowed as she flipped through an online boutique, the glow of the screen reflecting in her bright eyes. Frank sighed. He dropped his lunchbox on the counter and leaned against it. "I'm thinking of taking the night off from overtime," he said cautiously. "I've been studying this coding thing online. If I can get through this course, I might qualify for something better." Caitlin finally looked up, her lips pursed. "You're serious about this coding thing?" "Yeah," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "If I can land a better job, I won't have to spend so many hours at the factory, and it pays way better." Caitlin set her phone down and crossed her arms. Her silk blouse shimmered in the light. "That's great, Frank. But what about now? I mean, we've got bills piling up, and my friends, God, they all have husbands who are, I don't know, more established." Frank's face fell. "I'm trying. I'll figure it out." She stood, smoothing the folds of her designer skirt. "Trying doesn't put money in the bank, Frank. Have you seen how much interest we're paying on those loans? I'm already behind on one payment." "That's because you keep buying—" "Don't," she interrupted sharply, her tone like a slap. "Don't you dare make this about me. You think I like having to buy these things? I need to look decent, Frank. If I don't, what do people think of you?" Frank clenched his jaw, swallowing down the argument bubbling in his chest. "It's not about looking good for them, Caitlin. It's about making sure we're okay. And these loans—" He exhaled heavily. "They're drowning us." Caitlin's eyes softened, but only slightly. "You know I can't work a 9-to-5 like you. Creativity isn't a steady paycheck." He stared at her, the weight of his long days crushing down on him. "I'm doing everything I can." She shrugged, picking up her phone again. "Then do more." Frank didn't reply. Instead, he picked up his lunchbox, walked to their small office, and shut the door behind him. As he booted up the computer, the image of Caitlin laughing with her friends, their lives gilded with wealth, flashed in his mind. He clenched his fists. He wasn't sure how much more he could give, but for her, he thought grimly, maybe he'd have to. The metallic hum of machinery buzzed in Frank's ears as he wiped the sweat from his brow. His back ached from hours spent lugging heavy materials and operating outdated equipment. The thought of another day ending with Caitlin's demands loomed over him like a dark cloud. That night, back home, Frank sat at the kitchen table, staring at a growing mountain of bills. The math didn't lie. They were barely staying afloat. Every paycheck disappeared into loan payments, credit card debt, and household expenses. His dream of finishing the online course and escaping the factory felt like it was slipping further and further away. He dropped the calculator and ran a hand through his damp hair. If only she'd stop spending. The front door creaked open, and Caitlin swept in, a gleaming handbag dangling from her arm. It was bright red, with gold accents that caught the kitchen light. Frank's heart sank. "Is that new?" he asked, his voice low. Caitlin glanced at the bag, brushing off his question. "Oh, this? Yes, but don't worry. It was on sale." "On sale?" Frank's voice rose, and he grabbed one of the bills from the table, shaking it for emphasis. "We're drowning in debt, Caitlin. You promised you'd stop." Caitlin rolled her eyes and placed the bag gently on a chair, as though it were a priceless artifact. "You're overreacting. It's important to look presentable. What would people think if I showed up with some cheap old thing?" Frank stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What people, Caitlin? Your friends? The ones with husbands who apparently do everything better than me?" Caitlin crossed her arms defensively. "I'm just saying, look at Jenny's husband. He started his own construction business and makes 6 figures now. Or Lisa's husband. He's in real estate. Do you know how successful they are? And here you are, stuck in a dead-end job. Frank's hands balled into fists at his sides. I'm working overtime every day just to keep this roof over our heads. If you'd stop squandering money, maybe I'd have the chance to get ahead. Maybe I could finally finish my course and get a better job. Don't put this all on me, Caitlin shot back, her cheeks flushing. Do you know how hard it is to keep up appearances? I've already cut back. I'm trying to save. Frank let out a bitter laugh. Save? By buying a designer bag? Caitlin, this isn't saving. It's burying us deeper. Caitlin glared at him, her voice icy. You're just bitter because you can't keep up. I should have married someone successful instead of a man who's too stubborn to try harder. Frank's face darkened. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the small kitchen. You think this is easy for me? Maybe you should find yourself a normal job and earn some money. Then you'd see how tough it is out there. Caitlin flinched but quickly recovered, her expression shifting to one of wounded pride. I have an artistic soul, Frank. Do you expect me to rot in some prison of a job just because you can't make enough? I need freedom to create. Frank's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at her, the woman he'd once adored, now wrapped up in her own world of superficiality. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped outside. He walked aimlessly down the street, trying to shake off the anger that churned in his chest. But as the stars blinked overhead, one thought kept circling back in his mind. How did we end up here? Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. Frank walked aimlessly. His breath came out in short puffs as his thoughts churned, dragging him back to the past he'd long tried to bury. He remembered the moment he dropped out of college. His mother had been sick, cancer, they said, though it felt like a curse. He had been the only one to take care of her, their family long fractured. He had dreams then, big ones, a degree, a good career, maybe even traveling the world. But dreams didn't pay hospital bills. He picked up shifts at the factory, trading his textbooks for steel-toed boots and a paycheck. And then Caitlin entered his life. She was everything he didn't know he needed, bright-eyed and full of laughter. She didn't care that he was a factory worker. They often went for walks in the park and nature, had picnics or took food from some eateries. Back then, she didn't talk about luxury bags or grand homes. They'd said about love was all they'd need. Frank smiled faintly at the memory, but it quickly faded. Somewhere along the way, Caitlin had changed. Or maybe it was gradual, too small to notice at first. Her modesty gave way to ambition, not for success, but for appearances. First, it was the occasional complaint about their small house. Then came the subtle digs about how her friends' husbands were climbing the ladder of success, while Frank stayed on the factory floor. And now, it felt like nothing he did was ever enough. He stopped at a small park bench and sat down, his hands resting on his knees. He wasn't a stupid man. He was hardworking, and when he put his mind to something, he got it done. But life had a way of slamming doors in his face. Every time he tried to move forward, something, his mother's illness, Caitlin's demands, or the crushing weight of bills, dragged him back. It wasn't fair. Yet he couldn't seem to say that out loud without feeling weak. The walk didn't clear his mind, but his legs were tired, so he headed home. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the bedroom light leaking under the door. As he stepped inside, he could hear the muffled sound of Caitlin's tears. Not loud, but deliberate. "Where have you been, Frank?" she called out, her voice tinged with irritation. She emerged from the bedroom, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes glistening with practiced tears. "You ran off and we didn't even finish our conversation." Frank exhaled deeply. "Caitlin, I needed to cool off. I couldn't stay here and keep arguing." She crossed her arms, her voice sharpening. "You've changed, Frank. You're becoming so greedy. I thought you were a generous man, but maybe I was wrong." Frank clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his temper in check. "And I thought you were a wise woman, who could support her husband instead of throwing accusations." Her eyes widened and she shot back, "Oh, so now you're trying to make me feel guilty? Maybe it's time I find someone kinder, someone more generous, someone successful. Those words hit him like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened and his vision blurred with anger. He didn't yell. He just turned on his heel, went to the closet, and grabbed a blanket and pillow. Caitlin watched him, her expression shifting from triumph to shock. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I'm sleeping on the couch," Frank said evenly, though his voice was laced with anger. "If you have a problem with me, Caitlin, then go ahead. Look for whoever you want, because right now you've completely lost your head. All you care about is money, money that's never enough for you." Caitlin gasped, her voice rising. "You don't even want to understand me. My God, Frank, you've become callous as a stone." Frank didn't answer. He carried the bedding to the couch, laid it out, and sank onto the lumpy cushions. His body was heavy, his head pounding, but sleep wouldn't come. Caitlin's words echoed in his mind, slicing deeper each time he replayed them. "Maybe it's time I find someone kinder, more generous, and successful." He stared at the ceiling, his chest tight with pain. The following weeks dragged on, each day blending into the next for Frank. He threw himself into his work, hoping the physical exhaustion would drown out the chaos brewing at home. Caitlin, meanwhile, seemed unaffected by the tension between them. She carried on as if nothing had changed, shopping, chatting with her friends, and spending long hours scrolling through her phone. One evening, Frank came home to find her sitting on the couch, laughing at something on her old phone. A second phone, sleek and new, sat on the coffee table beside her. The sight of it made his stomach churn. He hadn't asked her about it yet, unwilling to spark another argument, but the nagging suspicion that something wasn't right gnawed at him. He dropped his lunchbox on the counter, muttered a greeting. Caitlin barely glanced up from her conversation. While Frank changed his clothes, he pondered the idea of taking a vacation. He desperately needed a break, not just from the factory, but from the constant strain Caitlin's behavior was putting on him. Maybe a few days away would give him the clarity he needed to figure out what to do next. When he returned to the living room, Caitlin was gone, her laughter echoing faintly from another room. The second phone was still on the table, the screen dark. Frank glanced toward the hallway, where Caitlin had disappeared, then back at the phone. Just as he was about to turn away, a notification lit up the screen. Frank froze. The message was from a dating app. His chest tightened. He reached for the phone, his hands trembling. Unlocking it was surprisingly easy. Caitlin had used the same PIN she always did. The app opened immediately, revealing her profile, a polished photo of her, heavily filtered, accompanied by a bio that read, "Looking for someone exciting. Life is too short to settle. Ready to communicate with an intelligent and successful man who has a generous and kind heart." Frank's breath hitched as he stared at the words. The message thread below confirmed everything. She had been actively chatting with other men, flirting shamelessly and arranging meetups. This wasn't a joke, nor was it just a fleeting emotional outburst. Caitlin was serious. The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment, Frank thought he might pass out. But instead of confronting her then and there, he quietly pulled out his phone and took a picture of her profile. He needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence of what she was doing. As the initial shock began to wear off, rage bubbled up inside him. It wasn't just the dating app. It wasn't just the debt she'd buried them in. It was the blatant disregard for everything they'd built together. Frank had given up so much for Caitlin, for them, and now she was throwing it all away. Later that night, long after Caitlin had gone to bed, Frank took her old phone from the table. He thumbed through her messages, his heart sinking further with each word. There it was, plans for a creative party with her friends, complete with hints about meeting successful and interesting men. One message in particular stood out. "This could be the perfect chance, Caitlin. You deserve better than Frank." Frank nearly threw the phone across the room. Instead, he set it down carefully, his hands shaking with barely restrained fury. He sat back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. "That's it," he thought. "This marriage is over. There's no love left here, no trust, no future." For years, Frank had endured Caitlin's demands, her criticisms, and her endless desire to live up to the expectations of her friends. But this was the final straw. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. The next morning, Frank trudged into work. But this time, the weight on his shoulders felt different. For years, the factory had been his lifeline, his grindstone, his prison. Today, it felt like something else, a stepping stone toward freedom. During his lunch break, he knocked on his boss's door. "Hey, Frank," his boss said, looking up from his desk. "What's up?" "I need a few days off," Frank said, his voice firm. "I've got some personal matters to handle." The boss raised an eyebrow but nodded. "You've been putting in overtime for months. I'll approve it. Just let me know when you'll be back." "Thanks," Frank said, relieved. "I appreciate it." That afternoon, Frank sat in a small office downtown, opposite a sharp-eyed lawyer named Douglas Burke. The man's office was modest, but his demeanor was anything but. His crisp suit and steady gaze exuded confidence. "Tell me everything," Douglas said, folding his hands. Frank pulled out his phone and showed Douglas the photos of Caitlin's dating app profile. He also detailed her spending habits, the loans, and her friends' enabling influence. The lawyer studied the screenshots, his lips curling into a small, calculating smile. "This is good," Douglas said, his tone almost gleeful. "Very good. Her dating profile and those messages give us a strong angle. We'll argue that she was siphoning family resources not for household needs, but to fund her lifestyle and attract a lover. Judges don't like seeing marital funds misused for infidelity." Frank nodded. "I just want out. I don't want to be stuck with her debts or the dogs." Douglas smirked. "The dogs won't be an issue. As for the debts, we'll need to prove they were solely hers. I recommend a financial examination. It'll take some time, but we can trace every loan, every luxury purchase, and make it clear in court that you weren't a party to it." "Do it," Frank said without hesitation. Douglas handed him a list of tasks. First, open a new bank account and have your paycheck deposited there. Second, gather every document you can find. Loan agreements, bank statements, receipts, anything that ties her spending to her debts. Third, I'll coordinate with the financial examiner and start drafting the divorce papers. We'll also prepare a statement about the emotional and financial toll her behavior has taken on you. The goal is to keep you free of her debts and to limit the division of property. Frank exhaled slowly. It was a lot to take in, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Over the next few days, Frank followed Douglas's advice to the letter. Caitlin hadn't noticed the change yet. She was too preoccupied with her social life. At home, when Caitlin was out, Frank methodically copied every relevant document he could find. Loan agreements, credit card statements, receipts for luxury purchases, it all went into a folder. He felt a grim sense of satisfaction as the evidence piled up. "You wanted the best, Caitlin? Well, here it is." The financial examination revealed staggering numbers. Caitlin had spent tens of thousands of dollars on handbags, jewelry, spa treatments, and other indulgences, all while they struggled to make ends meet. Frank wasn't surprised, but seeing the cold, hard figures on paper was like a punch to the gut. Douglas was delighted. "This is exactly what we need," he said during their next meeting. "With this and the dating app profile, we have a strong argument that your marriage broke down because of her irresponsibility and infidelity." "Will I have to give up much in the divorce?" Frank asked. "You might have to part with some property, shared items like furniture or electronics, but we'll do everything we can to protect your finances and your future earnings," Douglas assured him. "And don't worry about the dogs. She'll keep them." "Fine by me," Frank said. He's not a fan of Yorkshire Terriers, which at least often wreaked havoc because Caitlin didn't know how to raise the dogs. As the days turned into weeks, Frank began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The lawyer's meticulous strategy gave him confidence. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a life without Caitlin's demands, a life where he could focus on himself and his dreams. Sitting at the kitchen table one night, Frank stared at the old laptop he used for his coding course. His future felt closer than ever. Just a little longer, he thought. Soon this weight will be gone. When all the preparations were finished and Frank received the documents, he decided to hand them to Caitlin personally. He had just taken a vacation and returned home much earlier than usual. Frank turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open, the midday sun casting long shadows across the living room floor. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of music coming from the bedroom. He stepped inside, taking in the faint scent of Caitlin's expensive perfume lingering in the air. When he reached the bedroom, he paused in the doorway. Caitlin was seated at her vanity, meticulously applying mascara. Her lips were painted a bold red, and a sequined dress hung on the back of a chair. Jewelry was strewn across the vanity as she debated which pieces would best complement her outfit. She didn't notice Frank at first, humming softly to herself. "Home early," Frank said casually, leaning against the doorframe. His sudden presence startled her. She turned, eyes narrowing as she took in his untired, purposeful demeanor. "Frank, what are you doing here? Why aren't you at work?" "I took a vacation," he said simply. "I'm tired of working like a robot. Turns out I'm a living, breathing human being who needs a break." Caitlin blinked, caught off guard by his tone. "A vacation?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Then her brow furrowed. "When's your paycheck coming in? We've got bills piling up." Frank's lips curled into a wry grin. "I don't care when the paycheck comes, Caitlin. I'm done thinking about money all the time." She hesitated, sensing an unusual shift in his attitude. "Frank, you're acting strange," she said, her tone cautious. "I thought you were a responsible man, but now you're starting to sound like an immature child." He chuckled, the sound light but edged with something sharper. "Maybe it's time for me to have my turn as the careless one. And you know what? I think it's time you found a stable job to pay for all your little luxuries. It might teach you something." Her face darkened, and her voice grew sharp. "Since when did my husband decide it was okay to speak so rudely to a beautiful, elegant wife like me? Frank, you should appreciate me. I've spent my best years with you, and I've tried not to complain." Frank threw his head back and laughed, the sound startling her. "You don't complain? That's rich, Caitlin. So, where are you headed all dressed up this time?" She glanced at her dress before replying curtly, "To a party. There's a presentation of paintings and live music. You know these events are important for my creative career." She tossed her hair over her shoulder. "And don't forget about your paycheck. I don't want anyone to think we can't pay the bills." Frank sighed heavily and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope and held it out to her. "Here," he said. "Take this. It'll solve all our problems." Caitlin's eyes lit up as she took the envelope, expecting cash or a check. But as she opened it and scanned the first few pages, her face turned ashen. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the divorce papers. "What? What is this?" she stammered. Her voice rose into a scream. "A divorce? Frank, what the hell is this? I'm not ready for this." Frank folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe. His eyes were cold, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Not ready? What's wrong, Caitlin? Haven't had enough time to find yourself a successful man who's better than me?" Her mouth opened and closed as she struggled to respond. "What? What are you talking about? If this is about what I said, I was just angry. I didn't mean it." Frank tilted his head, his expression impassive. "Caitlin, save the explanations. I understand everything about you. Let's leave the rest for the court." Her panic deepened, her voice pleading now. "Frank, please, we can talk about this. Fix this. I didn't mean anything by it." But Frank didn't answer. He pushed off the doorframe and walked past her, heading to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. Caitlin stood frozen, clutching the divorce papers as though they might disappear if she held on tight enough. In the silence that followed, Frank felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. Caitlin stormed into the kitchen, clutching the divorce papers like they were a personal insult. "I want an explanation," she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. Frank calmly finished his glass of water, setting it down on the counter with deliberate care. He turned to her, his expression unbothered, even cheerful. "Caitlin," he said, his tone almost amused, "why don't you go to your party? You've got a whole evening of whatever it is you do at these things. I've got plans too." "Plans?" Caitlin asked, her voice cracking with frustration. "What plans?" Frank straightened his shirt and shrugged nonchalantly. "I'm going to a party of my own. You know, catch up with some old friends, have a couple of beers, just relax for once." Caitlin stared at him, horrified. His calm demeanor was like a slap in the face. "You're going to a bar?" she spat. "While I'm here trying to figure out what's going on? This is serious, Frank." He gave her a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I know it is. That's why I'll be back tomorrow morning, to pick up my things. Have a good evening, Caitlin." As he headed for the door, Caitlin ran after him, her voice rising. "Frank, I'm not letting this go. You can't do this to me. I'm still your wife. You have responsibilities." Frank paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. His voice was steady, almost too casual. "Just one small correction, Caitlin. Ex-wife." He waved dismissively and stepped outside, leaving her standing there, stunned and seething. In the days that followed, Frank stuck to his word. Early one morning, he arrived at the house with a couple of boxes, packing up the last of things without a word. She stood in the hallway, glaring at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had resolved to fight him in court, convinced she could salvage something from this mess. But Caitlin had underestimated Frank. And more importantly, she had underestimated his lawyer. When the trial began, Frank and his lawyer, Douglas Burke, executed their strategy flawlessly. Caitlin arrived with her own attorney, confident she could paint herself as the wronged party. But her confidence quickly crumbled. Douglas began by presenting the financial examination, which detailed Caitlin's extravagant spending habits. Every loan, every designer bag, every piece of overpriced jewelry was laid bare for the court to see. Douglas argued that Caitlin had drained the family's resources for her personal indulgences, leaving Frank to shoulder the financial burden. Then came the screenshots of Caitlin's dating app profile. The courtroom fell silent as Douglas handed copies to the judge. "This," he said, his voice cool and measured, "is proof that Mrs. Donnelly wasn't just misusing family funds. She was actively seeking relationships outside her marriage while expecting Mr. Donnelly to finance her lifestyle." Caitlin's lawyer tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge didn't even flinch as Douglas presented the messages Caitlin had sent to her friends about her plans to meet successful men at her parties. Caitlin, for her part, tried to defend herself. She claimed the dating app was a harmless distraction, that the loans were necessary, and that she had always been a loving wife. But the weight of the evidence crushed her arguments. The judge was unimpressed. When the final ruling came, Caitlin was left to face the consequences of her actions. The judge ordered her to assume full responsibility for the debts she had incurred. To pay off the loans, she was forced to sell much of the property, including her prized jewelry and designer bags. Unfortunately, their common property was also damaged, but Frank was prepared for it morally because the lawyer had warned about it. His future income was protected, and he was absolved of any responsibility for Caitlin's financial mess. 6 months after the divorce, Frank's life had transformed in ways he hadn't thought possible. He still clocked in at the factory, but without the weight of Caitlin's endless demands and debt, it didn't feel like a prison anymore. He took more days off, savoring evenings spent working on his online courses and refining the skills that had always been just out of reach. His persistence paid off. One crisp autumn morning, Frank opened an email offering him a position as a junior developer at a local tech firm. The salary wasn't huge, but it was enough. More importantly, it was a step toward the life he had always dreamed of, a life where hard work paid off and he could finally leave the factory behind. Meanwhile, Caitlin's world had crumbled. News of her divorce and the debts she had racked up spread quickly among her friends and acquaintances. The same women she had tried so hard to impress now whispered about her behind her back, their pity thinly veiled with smug satisfaction. For the first time in her life, Caitlin had to take a job, an entry-level sales associate at a luxury boutique. She spent long days on her feet, folding clothes for customers who reminded her of the life she used to flaunt. Caitlin has never been able to find a rich and generous man. She had dates, but the men quickly realized that Caitlin only cared about money. Caitlin blamed Frank for her struggles, weaving tales of his coldness and selfishness to anyone who would listen. But her stories gained little sympathy. People saw through her facade, and her audience shrank with each retelling. Frank, on the other hand, thrived. His new job reignited his confidence, and he found joy in simple things: a weekend hike, a good book, a quiet beer with friends. He no longer felt tethered to someone else's ambitions or judgments. For the first time, he could focus on himself, and he liked the man he was becoming. Frank walked into his old factory for the last time to collect his belongings. His co-workers cheered him on, proud of his leap into a new career. Standing in the parking lot, Frank took a deep breath of the crisp air, letting it fill his lungs with a sense of possibility. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.